Our passage this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, the 3rd chapter, starting with the 13th verse and reading through verse 17. It's the story of Jesus' baptism. At that time, Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan River so that John would baptize him. John tried to stop him and said, "I need to be baptized by you, yet you come to me?" And Jesus answered, "Allow me to be baptized now. This is necessary to fulfill all righteousness." So John agreed to baptize Jesus. When Jesus was baptized, he immediately came up out of the water. Heaven was opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God coming down like a dove and resting on him. A voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I dearly love. I find happiness in him." And sometimes we hear this passage with God saying, "In him I am well pleased." So we all have a need to be known. Well, sure, some of us are a little more introverted than others, a little more willing sometimes to hang in the background, but that's not the point of all of this. We all share this deep and heartfelt need to be known. The trouble is sometimes we get so focused on making sure that we're seen by others, that we get confused about the difference between being seen and being known. Or we focus so much on being known by others, we don't pay attention to the value that comes from knowing ourselves and knowing that God knows us. So this is the 3rd week of our series, Getting Ready to Get Ready. And we've been talking about some of the work that goes into making a change in life, whether it's a change in habits, a change in career, or just a change in our general direction and purpose in life. We started out by considering how change may not happen because we haven't taken the time to get ready for a change to happen. We think because we want the change, or we think we ought to change, or someone has told us that we ought to change, that if we just jump right in, we can make it happen. The problem with that, as we've shared, is that if we aren't truly ready, if we haven't done the work of getting ready to get ready, then we may not be ready to follow through. That first week we provided, and we still have available, some resources that describe the stages of change and some suggestions on how to figure out which stage of change you might now find yourself. We shared the story of Simeon and how ready he was for a change that was about to take place in his life when he saw the infant Jesus at the temple, and that he could stop waiting and celebrate what he saw, and that he could know that his life in many ways was complete. And then last week we talked about the sheer challenge of making a change, acknowledging that even making a small change in life, a little adjustment, our habits, our work, our health, it's hard. It's hard work. It takes a certain amount of courage. And we looked at the story of the Magi, or the wise men, traveling to see the child Jesus, but choosing to defy Herod and go home by another way, not telling Herod where to find the child. And we explored the reality that sometimes even the best decisions that we can make have consequences that we did not intend, and consequences that we cannot control. So this week we're going to consider that thing that we often neglect in our lives, that thing that may be a lot of the reason that we've adopted less than helpful habits, that we aren't happy, that we aren't settled, that we aren't living the life that we want to be living, or the life that we believe God created us to be living. And that thing is our own ability to know ourselves and to trust, really trust, that God knows us and that God loves us. So Father Henri Nouwen was a priest, a writer, a professor, a spiritual advisor. He was, and he still is, a very much admired, much respected voice on all things spiritual, but most certainly on those parts of the spiritual life that are sometimes hard to see. And Nouwen had this to say about being known. One of the greatest dangers in spiritual life is self-rejection. Hear that. One of the greatest dangers in spiritual life is self-rejection. Now that's kind of a harsh sounding term, isn't it? Self-rejection. Psychologists tell us that it's a pretty common experience, though. and that it's possible for us to experience our own self-rejection on a regular basis. So if we think about it, minor rejections happen every day. Maybe we toss out an idea that somebody doesn't notice, or we have a social media post and we don't get the number of likes that we think that we'd like to, or maybe some attempts that we make to connect with other people. All are places and ways that we might feel overlooked or somewhat rejected in pretty normal ways. And then, of course, there are the rejections that can crush us, losing our jobs, or being snubbed by a friend, being left behind in a relationship, being outcast by a family or an entire community. That can result in the kind of pain that has the potential to leave us absolutely paralyzed. So while it is possible for others to trip us up, to cause us hurt, what Nouwen and a whole host of others would say is that it is the ways that we reject ourselves that are the ones that can cause the most harm. And if we're doing harm to ourselves at the same time that we are thinking that we ought to change or trying to bring about a change, well, you can see how a cycle would develop where we would get caught up in something that never brings about the results that we want or the results that we need. So our gospel story today is about the baptism of Jesus. And there are several parts to the story that can speak to us in particular ways. That Jesus chose to be baptized as others were doing. That Jesus insisted that being baptized was a worthy step for him to take. That God spoke after Jesus' baptism and claimed him as his own. And that is where I'd like us to land today. That moment of God claiming Jesus and calling him beloved, the one who delights him, the one in whom he is well pleased. Because that is part of what we believe happens in our baptisms, that God claims us, that God tells us how much we are loved, that God tells us that God is pleased with us. And when you think about the thing that you most want to change in your life, what is behind it? Is it a need to be seen as someone who is more than enough, more than skinny enough, smart enough, wealthy enough, strong enough, successful enough, popular enough, young enough? You could go on and on. And where in all of that can we carve out some room for us to be able to hear God say to us, "You are my child, and in you I am pleased"? Have you ever thought, if people really knew me, there's no way they would love me? That's the kind of thing that Nouwen said does us the most harm. Believing such a thing about ourselves, he said, is choosing the road toward darkness. Baptism is a profound moment in our faith life. It is a moment in which we are told that we are indeed enough. That God accepts us, that God loves us, that God desires to do amazing things through us. And baptism is a way of God saying, this child, this person is enough and will always be enough. Not only enough, but loved, beloved, touched by my grace and known by me. And isn't that something that we all need to hear? We celebrated a baptism on Sunday morning, the baptism of an infant. I said a few words of things that I believe and words that I believe carry a deep level of power and meaning. And Matt and Jackie Miner brought their son Lucas to be baptized, and they made some promises to God, some promises with the congregation, some promises to their son Lucas. And then when that happened too, those who were gathered from the congregation said some words. Another example of all of us coming together and saying things that carry meaning and hope and promise. But when that infant was baptized, that sweet baby boy was baptized, someone else spoke as well. God speaks at every baptism. God moves and acts at every baptism. God claimed that child as God's own, just as God did at each of our baptisms, saying, "This child is mine. my beloved, and saying once again to those of us who are gathered, you, each of you in this room, is also mine, my beloved. So as another piece of work of getting ready, I'm going to ask you to just grab hold of that idea that you are indeed one of God's beloved, whether you've been baptized or not, to just be able to bask in hearing those words, I claim you, I love you, you are my beloved, I am delighted in you. So grab hold of that idea and work to make yourself willing to accept God's love for yourself and find that love for yourself as well. And so as we close today, very simply, I'm going to ask you to say with me, I am God's child, deserving of love and respect, and God will use me to change the world. Would you say that with me now? I am God's child, deserving of love and respect, and God will use me to change the world. Say it, believe it, let it sink into your heart and soul, and know that you are one of God's beloved, and in you, God is pleased. Amen.